emergency and empathy. That is the theme. We are so pleased. This is always one of the most eagerly awaited events at the Denman Festival, when Des Kennedy gets up on stage, uses his remarkable voice to bring another person's voice into the room. And that other remarkable voice today is Dr. Brian Goldman, whom we've only known, his voice we've only known from the radio. And now we have him here in person. We're thrilled to welcome both Des Kennedy and Dr. Brian Goldman.
Thanks, Stuart. What a great house. It's been a wonderful festival, still is, but it's a remarkable thing about this event, in my mind, that so much gets packed in. I mean, you're literally sort of staggering around by the end of the day, because it's been so dense with ideas and insights and information, and it goes so fast. Suddenly here we are at the last morning, and we'll be dispersing and going our separate ways. So it's to me it's a wonderful, and I found this a particularly amiable festival. I think in part because of all of you, obviously, but also in part because of the authors that came this year. And I was so impressed at the number of authors who continue to come to the other readings and presentations, which doesn't always happen. But it happened in spades this year, and it was really, really nice to see. And I'm, of course, delighted and thrilled to be up on the stage with one of the best known and best loved physicians in the country. What am I going to say about this guy?
By some, but not all. Please don't follow me on Twitter.
But I will tell you that in order to prepare for the session, of course, I read both The Power of Kindness and also The Power of Teamwork. Both well worth the read and packed with information and insight. And I took copious notes, of course, to get ready for this session, page after page of writing down this, that, and the other thing, questions I could ask, and then I got all my, questions worked out and typed up and put down in my book. And so then Friday morning, we're starting up, and I had to give a little talk, and then Brian was going to do the first big talk. And he comes up to me, and he says, "How about you take notes of everything I say, so I don't repeat myself on Sunday?" I immediately thought of Freddie Prinz's old line, "It's not my job!" But I didn't say that, and I happily took notes. So I wrote the first page of notes. Oh, then another page of notes. Then another page of notes. I ended up with 4 pages of notes of everything he talked about, almost all of which corresponded exactly to the prepared questions that I had. So we're going to just idle the time away here this morning rather than do anything serious.
We'll just reminisce on what I talked about.
Right, yeah.
Remember that?
Oh, it was great when you said that. But starting out here, in one of the books, I forget which, you do describe the ER room as an oasis of quiet followed by tsunamis of tumult, which is a good line. How has the ER room been for you the last 2 years?
Wow. Well, the emergency department has gone through waves. And 2 years, to collapse the 2 years, into a few sentences, we went through different phases. I remember when, I don't know how many of you follow the NBA, when the Utah Jazz player Rudy Gobert tested positive, and the Raptors happened to have passed through, and there was that moment, and then there was the moment when Tom Hanks tested positive. He was in Australia at the time, and the World Health Organization declared that COVID was a pandemic, and we were in the middle of that alpha wave, and everything ground to a halt in the emergency department. We were practicing how we would resuscitate people who had COVID. We would presume they had COVID, and some marvelous things happened during that period of time, but it was eerily quiet for the longest period of time, and our volumes were way down. They paid us to be there when we hardly saw patients. So many people decided that the emergency department was the last place they wanted to go to if they were ill or injured. Just think about that. And that carried on for the better part of a year, I think. And then, things opened up. We got, well, at least, certainly 6 months things opened up. We were in the summer, and people, of course, are not, they have their seasonal illnesses, and they come in during the summer. But that carried on for a long period of time, and then people started to drift back, especially since the beginning of this year. And we have just been crushed by the number of people who have been coming to the emergency department since then. And it's been building and building and building and building, and the hospitals are now 120, 130, 150% of capacity. The emergency departments we're seeing more people than ever. We are incredibly busy. We're seeing, we went through phases when we were seeing lots of people with COVID. Today, not as much, although it's starting to drift up again. You've got to follow those waves. We're into the 7th wave, I think, now. And, Omicron, B4, B5 subvariants. And we are, at the moment, seeing, the number of people who are admitted to hospital with COVID, either with COVID or because of COVID, are creeping up. But we're also seeing a lot of people with complicated illnesses that are more severe, more complex, more life-threatening than they might have been in another era. So instead of seeing somebody with stage 2 ovarian cancer, we're seeing somebody diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer, breast cancer, lung cancer, other chronic diseases, heart disease.
And why is that happening?
It's complicated. I think one of the reasons is that people tended to say, I'm okay. Why do I need to burden the system? They've heard so much about burned out emergency staff, hospital staff, ICU staff. Why would I want to add to their burdens? And I think that people have kind of sucked it up and have said, I'm going to kind of just get through this. Often people don't know what's lurking inside them until there's, we take a CT scan or do a biopsy. I think that, and I've got to be very careful with my words here, I'm not slagging primary care, family doctors. Everybody's done the best they can under the circumstances. I think that it has long been difficult to see your family doctor or nurse practitioner when you need to see them, as soon as you think you need to see them. So that even if you're fortunate enough to have access to primary care, you may find that you're waiting a couple of weeks or 3 weeks to see somebody, and sometimes that can make all the difference in the world where something that might have been manageable becomes more of an emergency and you've got to go to the emergency department. So that's part of it.
And is there a general apprehension that hospitals are a breeding ground for COVID?
That was what we, that seemed to be the message in the beginning. And I've been wearing, we wear N95 masks, we were wearing face shields and gowns and gloves, sometimes double gowning and double gloving, depending on what the resuscitations that we were doing. And I think that we've done a pretty good job of preventing transmission of COVID in some parts of the hospital, but not in all parts of the hospital. We've had outbreaks. They're not common. They're not super spreader events in general. the more we know about COVID, the more we're able to use science to prevent the spread. So, but I think you're quite right, Des, there was a general apprehension about coming to the hospital. And certainly during the first and second waves, people said, I didn't know if it was all right. Is it okay if I'm here?
And was it a great learning curve in hospital, among staff? Did you feel as though you were adequately prepared for that kind of event, or did it come out of the blue for you?
Well, that depends on where you work. And knowledge-wise, things were changing rapidly. We started with no vaccines, medications that we weren't sure would work, antiviral medications that were already either in the hopper to be approved or had been approved for other viral illnesses, and they were tried on COVID, and in some cases they worked, like remdesivir worked, and monoclonal antibodies worked. We were trying to kind of feel our way through what protections would be necessary to prevent the transmission of COVID from healthcare worker to healthcare worker, from patient to healthcare worker. We developed something very quickly called a protected code blue, where if a patient was brought into the emergency department by paramedics in respiratory distress and needed to be intubated, placed on a ventilator, we would assemble a team, and we would don, in a very particular order, the personal protective equipment, PPE, so the face shields and the N95 masks and one set of gloves, second set of gloves, etc. And we would have spotters, people making sure that we were donning it correctly in the right order and doffing it in the right order so that we didn't spread germs. So knowledge-wise, we were prepared. I have to say that in many institutions, especially during the first and second waves, they lacked adequate supplies of personal protective equipment. So they didn't have enough masks. Certainly if you widen out the sort of commentariat to North America, there were plenty of places in the United States where they simply lacked PPE, and people were placing their N95 mask in a baggie and bringing it home and then bringing it back the next day because they weren't able to have another one. They weren't sure that they were going to have another one. And there were supplies of counterfeit N95 masks that didn't work the way they were supposed to work. So we were dealing with a lot of that. I mean, it's a blur to me. We're now almost 2.5 years since the beginning of the pandemic, and a lot of time has gone by, and a lot of things have happened in between. Now we have vaccines, we have antivirals like Paxlovid and other treatments, and we're learning so much about that. But we had a knowledge gap and we had a PPE gap, and depending on where you worked, you were in trouble. And early on, a fair number of healthcare professionals on the front lines did get COVID, and some of them died of it because they were exposed, perhaps unnecessarily.
Can you talk about the morale in general in the hospital? I remember I was in the hospital when COVID was early days, and outside, this was the Comox Valley Hospital, all along the roadway outside were these hand-painted signs, plywood signs, thanking the healthcare workers. And it was very moving. And so we went from that, and then you end up with these idiots attacking healthcare workers outside of hospitals. So it must have been a real roller coaster ride, I would think.
Yeah, it has, Des. Certainly there are colleagues who say, particularly nursing colleagues, who say that they went from heroes to zeros, from one wave to the next, there is a great deal of anger in society, a great deal of aggression, verbal aggression, and sometimes it's physical aggression. That kind of punctuated or culminated in those demonstrations. I work in downtown Toronto, where there were demonstrations against frontline healthcare workers, against mask mandates and vaccine mandates. And I think that if you, and in this case, I'm not repeating myself, I'm playing off of what I talked about a couple of days ago. Healthcare professionals tend to go into healthcare for many reasons, but one of them is to assuage their feelings of inferiority or inadequacy. I talked about feelings of shame that they won't talk about. If you do a literature search right now, National Library of Congress, PubMed, and search the term shame in medicine, you're not going to find very much. You may find a lot of articles about shaming patients, but not about health professionals, frontline healthcare professionals who feel shame. But that's to me, having read the books by Brene Brown, I understand that the characteristics of that mindset of an inferiority complex, ultra sensitivity to criticism, and I'm getting that on social media right now, that health professionals are ultra sensitive to criticism. If they are very quick to read insult into tweets where it's not intended. And I've experienced that a lot lately because I inhabit two worlds. I inhabit the world of medical journalism and the world of broadcasting and the world of medicine. So I understand both worlds, but I'm astonished at that raw level of sensitivity to criticism. But that's a shame mentality. When somebody's that sensitive to criticism that they're, why do I know this? Because I'm pointing fingers? No, because I'm ashamed, Nick. I'm ashamed, Nick. I understand. I write about it because I know about it. So where are we now? We have health professionals who are driven to say yes to every request, to come in overtime, again, another shift, to suck it up, one more thing, one more committee, one more task, one more thing that I'll do. I'll stay 3 hours longer. And their bodies, their minds, their psyches, their souls are utterly depleted. That's where they are right now. And add to that those moments when a patient snaps and a well-trained health professional is just supposed to suck it up when it happens. But I've had colleagues, and I've had them on white coat, black card, including one, Kasim Tejpar, who walked up to a stretcher and was punched, cold cock punched, just like that. And he's working right now, and that is a miracle that he wasn't traumatized by that. Triage nurses who've been attacked physically. A short time after, my colleague, another colleague was punched, and she just dusted herself off and went back to work. And it's like, how can you do that?
And that's behavior that's happening now in a way that it didn't pre-COVID.
Absolutely, absolutely. So to long answer, I'm coming to the point. The point is that where are we now? We are brittle, angry, our reserve, our resilience is depleted, and there are more of us who are talking about leaving than ever before, quitting. I have said that for a while there, almost every week, every time I came back to do another shift every few days at my hospital, a nurse was saying goodbye. I'm saying goodbye after 5 years, 7 years, 10 years. And they're not all nurses close to retirement. Some of them are in the prime of their careers, in their early 30s, and much more to give. They're really good at what they do, and they're moving on.
And that's more mental distress than physical exhaustion, or both?
It's both. It's both. Especially in the hospitals where nurses are compelled to work overtime day after day after day, and they come to the fifth shift. Like, I can tell you, I have, as a physician, I have a lot more power over, and control over my schedule. And I've always worked part-time to afford me more time to work, to work in broadcasting. And so one of the ways of immunizing yourself against burnout is to have choice, control, and I have both. But if you're a nurse who is compelled to come back a fifth day in a row, and knowing full well that they're short nurses and you're going to be asked to work an extra 4 hours of overtime, the difference between us on the front lines and others is that we don't know how to say no. And so we get past the point when we should have said no, we start making mistakes, we're exhausted, something bad happens, and or we don't realize just how ineffective we've become.
And how difficult has it been dealing with all of those realities on White Coat, Black Heart?
It's interesting. You know, there's many ways to answer that. You know, one way is that, you know, I remember before White Coat, Black Heart became what it is, famous, you know, it debuted in the summer of 2007, so 15 years ago. It's amazing, it's a long time. It's become a legacy show, like Quirks and Quarks. That's what they call it. It's kind of a, you know, it's a legacy show, so it's sort of, you know, I guess that's code for old. I guess. Anyway, there was like the stock and trade that first summer. What astonished people was that I pulled back the curtain and we heard authentic voices, the voices of people talking about what it's like to work a shift. You know, what makes them happy, what makes them sad, what makes them angry, peeved. Then the show became famous, and then people realized that there were consequences to speaking like that on the air. We've had people who've lost their jobs. You know, we don't, and now we think twice. If somebody is in danger, if we think somebody's going to lose their job or going to get into some serious trouble, then you know, we take steps to disguise their voice. So we went through that phase when people would sound like they're speaking authentically, but they really weren't. You can tell there's a difference. They won't go to certain places and talk about certain situations because you can hear the gears. You hear the gears turning in their mind. If I say this, am I going to lose my job? How much trouble am I going to get into? So that was kind of the longest phase until recently. And more recently, we have again encountered some people who are so fed up they don't care. They're just going to say what they want to say. And you know, we're still very, very mindful on the show, very mindful of that people that their jobs could be at stake and they could be the sole breadwinner of their families, and we don't want them. I don't want anybody to lose their job because they appeared on White Coat, Black Heart. I think that this stuff needs to be told. Absolutely, absolutely. You know, we are a very rigid kind of culture, very slow to change, very slow to realize that things cannot continue the way they are, and you know, there's a medical model to training, to handling situations. It's one of the reasons why I wrote the book, because I really think we have to examine ourselves and examine the culture in which we exist, and examine the systems that we use, because we are, you know, certainly we're under a lot of stress right now.
The controversies over vaccination, anti-vaxxers, et cetera. How does that intrude into the show, or does it, or what's your policy on it?
We tell, you know, the mission of White Coat, Black Heart is to tell stories of patients and families and frontline healthcare providers in the crucible, in the culture of modern medicine. And so that involves speaking to people from all walks of life and as many points of view as we can. I think the CBC is comfortable with a few no-go zones, and one of them would be we don't feel that, you know, that we have to provide alternate points of view if that alternate point of view is factually incorrect. So we don't feel as if we have to have somebody who's in favor of vaccination balance that with somebody who's opposed to vaccination. We don't do, and we're comfortable with that. And if somebody wants to complain about that, they can complain about that. You know, we have mechanisms to deal with that. So that's how we deal with that. You know, there are times when, you know, I have wanted to do stories about, you know, Russian bot farms that are fanning out and sending messages to us. You know, that there appeared to be a strong correlation between those messages that were sent out, you know, against Hillary Clinton's candidacy in 2016 and in favor of Donald Trump's, and taking an anti-vaccination point of view, and that the two of them actually correlated, that the kinds of messages that were being sent in favor of Trump and absurd things about Hillary Clinton and cults that she belonged to, that they seem to be paired with anti-vaccination messages. And certainly I am. There are ways to tell stories about that. I'm very interested, for instance, in telling stories about how people become influenced against vaccination. Where does that come from? Well, we've certainly done stories about that before White Coat Black Heart. We did a story about approaches to people, to parents of newborn kids who are reluctant to vaccinate their kids. And actually, we're seeing that right now. We're now seeing a resurgence in diseases like pertussis and measles right here in Canada, in North America, and we will see outbreaks because a lot of kids, a distressing percentage of infants, are well behind in their childhood. The vaccines that they should be receiving at the early stages of their lives.
Okay, let's move to the books.
Okay.
Since our primary objective here is to sell a lot of your books.
And thank you to Abraxas for selling books, because independent bookstores are the lifeblood of our democracy.
So, the power of kindness. You talked a little bit about this the other day and alluded to it now. You started off asking, am I a kind soul? Now, you didn't talk on Friday as much about your looking at yourself as a practitioner and suspecting that you'd lost a certain edge that you had as a young doctor.
Yeah. I think as I began to, you start medicine, you start studying, you have this awe and wonder, you're accumulating knowledge, you're getting, and with that knowledge, you begin to put it into practice, and I had enough of an ability to do that, to turn knowledge of history and physical into diagnoses, to make diagnoses, to act upon them, but in time, you become more aware of the consequences of your mistakes. And, do I make more mistakes than the next physician? Probably not. I probably make as many or as few as the next person, but they have such consequences that, you become burdened with them. There's a psychologist here, David Kuhl, here, practices on the West Coast, and he gives a talk called, for health professionals, called The Patients You Sleep With. No, it's not about that talk. It's the patients who wake you up at 4 o'clock in the morning. The ones you think about, the ones that are long gone, the ones who you didn't do so well on. And any honest physician, certainly in the early days of White Coat Black Heart, one of the things I would do is I would say, here's my worst mistake, blah, 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 blah. I talked about it in a TED Talk. How about you? And I would point the microphone towards a health professional, and they would look, like that, and then they'd start to talk, because people want to talk. They want to unburden themselves. So my point here is that, what has that got to do with kindness? I became very self-preoccupied with the mistakes I was making and the consequences of those mistakes. Health professionals are a perfectionistic lot, and that's part of the shame culture. People who can't wait to walk up to you to correct you. You might have said 1,000 wonderful things, but they've noticed the one thing you've said that's factually incorrect, and that's the thing they're going to tell you and that's the thing that's stuck with them. And why do they do that? Because they're nasty? No, because somebody did that to them. Somebody humiliated them at that point, and they're passing on something about the culture of medicine. What's that got to do with kindness? When you're that preoccupied, it's really hard to empathize with people. It's really hard, to now I can begin, I'm in a different headspace right now. I can start to think, what's Des thinking right now? We're smiling, we're connecting, is it going well? Is it going well for you? Like, are you, not is it going well for me? If I'm worried about is it going well for me, then I'm self-preoccupied. If I'm thinking, is it going well for you? Then we're doing well.
I'm hoping it's going well for them. But I think it is. I think it is.
Shall I walk? You know what? Sometimes this is a Madonna mic. Didn't they call them Madonna mics? I've done this. When's he going to talk about the book? I'm getting tired. I got to do my. I got some places to go. I haven't talked to the kids. Are they okay? The grandkids? Are they supposed to be coming over? By the way, shout out to Teresa Clinton. Oh, you're such a sweetie. I love you. Hug. Okay. Do you remember Leo Biscaya?
Yeah.
Yes, we're all old enough to remember him. He used to hug all of his guests. And can I also shout out one more person? Cindy Critchley. Where are you? You are so poised and so amazing. And thank you for holding my hand through this process and being so patient to have me here after 3 years. I needed to say those two things.
Good.
Okay.
Good. Now, getting back to your description, we are intrigued, all of us were intrigued by your description of yourself as a vulnerable narcissist. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, I think that anybody who thinks they can be the host of a radio show has to have a little bit of narcissism in there. There are, so basically, that's straight out of the book. A vulnerable narcissist, there are two kinds of narcissists. There's the vulnerable and the kind of invulnerable kind. And so, interestingly, or distressingly, that would put me in a category with the late Richard Nixon. And of course, he's been the subject of a lot of conversations recently because of Trump. And isn't that interesting that there's a world of difference between Donald Trump and, I think people understand instinctively that whatever Richard Nixon did, he is not Donald Trump. All right? And the difference between the two is that Richard Nixon had shame up the yin-yang. He could be shamed. And when those, Republican, Senate leaders led by Barry Goldwater said, it's time to go, and he asked them how many votes, and he, did he have enough votes to stave off being convicted in his impeachment, in the impending impeachment trial, which of course never took place. He could read the tea leaves. He obeyed the rules. When it came time to give over the tapes, he didn't burn them, he gave them. Compare and contrast that with, so that's a vulnerable narcissist. And, I am not we were both Capricorns. Interesting. You remember these things. And you know what? I have, in terms of character studies, I have an affinity for people of that ilk. And there's a part of me that could imagine being them, even though I don't do anything that they do. But Trump is of a completely different category. So to be clear, in that part of the book, the PPI, the psychopathic personality inventory that I took, is an inventory of normal people. It sees what clusters of unusual traits, narcissistic, Machiavellian, psychopathic traits, that cluster in normal populations, because it's a bell curve, and it takes all kinds to make a world, and nobody is purely, altruistic, altruistic for altruistic reasons. They may be altruistic for very self-centered reasons, and etc. So I'm not, I'm talking about this. I'm not talking about this as somebody who has a personality disorder. according to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. I'm talking about myself as having a cluster of traits, and what you're referring to is somebody who has a cluster of traits within the normal population. Then you have Richard Nixon, who had a personality disorder, and although we've been taught not to psychoanalyze, world leaders, psychiatrists won't do it. Donald Trump clearly has some. He has some psychopathic traits. There's something about the dark triad of Machiavellians, people where the ends justify the means. Clearly, he's got a lot of that. Narcissism, clearly, the way he frames his speeches, it's always about him. Somebody can lose a loved one in a battlefield, and Donald Trump turns the conversation into his favorite topic, which is him. I guess I can say that I'm not like Trump. That would be the shortest answer to that question. But
my question was under how much are you like Trump? But seriously, I just was interested in your description of yourself as having fragile self-esteem, being easily prone to anxiety and depression.
Yep.
Easily shamed and humiliated.
Even today,
and
right now.
Hate criticism.
Your friends, it took me a long time. I'll tell you a little story about this. Early in the pandemic, when we were in the first wave of Alpha, we had no vaccines. We had treatments that were dodgy, and we were just finding our way. I arrived at 11 o'clock to do an 11 p.m. to 9 a.m. shift. You see patients. You have triple coverage to start off, and then one of the physicians goes home, then another one goes home later on. The physician who came on before me, Paul Koblitz is his name, Dr. Paul Koblitz, he took note of the fact that people over the age of 60 at that time were considered earmarked for death if they got COVID. And he pulled me aside and he said, "Brian, I'll stay all night and do your intubations for you so that I wouldn't get exposed to COVID." And, first reaction, he thinks I need help. He thinks I need a little extra assistance. Second reaction, I started to cry. What a wonderful gesture. And I still get a lump in my throat every time I think about that. So that's the journey that I've made. And the last story that I tell in The Power of Teamwork is a story of no longer feeling as if I had to run every cardiac arrest and be the leader all the time. I could, my colleague Nadia Primiani, who is an amazingly talented, giving physician who has teamwork in her bones, was running the resuscitation of a patient who I had seen who'd taken a sudden turn for the worst, had a cardiac arrhythmia, and instead of feeling as if I had to kind of take over and show that I could still take over, I became her best follower, and part of a team. And that's one of the things that we don't do well in healthcare. In a crisis, we don't have a leader. We all kind of go into those resuscitations with this I alone mentality. I alone will solve this. I alone will fix this. I alone must fix this. If I don't fix this, everybody's going to know that I can't fix this. That's all the self-talk that we do. And the journey from me to we is learning that somebody's got to be a follower. And being a good follower means speaking truth to power. It means saying what you see, and I talk in the book about how to do that. How do you create a climate of safety where everybody in the room can say, this plan that you're dealing with, that you've adopted to save this patient isn't working, and this patient's going to die if you continue down that road. It's something that we don't do well, and if we did it better, we'd save more lives, and frankly, we would have less burnout. We would have more happiness, more joy and ecstasy, more of a greater sense that we did it. One of the nice things about COVID is that it brought us together in a crisis. They say in aviation, why have they learned the safety systems that we haven't learned in surgery? And the cynical answer is that they've created safety systems and redundancy of technology and processes where everybody who notices something says something, because if the plane goes down, everybody's going to die. And in the operating room, the patient will die, but the surgeons and the scrub nurses and the anesthesiologists and the circulating nurses will all carry on. Well, with COVID, everybody was exposed to the same danger at the same time. So I think it helped to galvanize us into teams. But I can tell you that in my own personal journey from me to we, I'm better with criticism. I'm not perfect, and I'm still prone to being shamed when I'm caught out making a mistake. I've had many opportunities. I now take a step outside myself, and I see myself, see how I'm reacting, and I can adjust to that. But my instinct is to bristle and to feel like I've been embarrassed.
Mm-hmm. And you talk about the kind of gunslinger mentality amongst the physicians, and that's still prevalent lots of places, that this guy knows everything, and the rest of you just fall in line behind.
We are, and there are many reasons for that. That is true. I think that in many medical cultures, we weaponize praise by only praising the praiseworthy, whatever that means. You said the gunslinger. The gunslinger in medicine, it really depends on where you work. That gunslinger might be somebody who is kind of somebody who's capable of who just knows a lot about every field in medicine. And there are some of us who are like that and they just have a fund of tremendous practical knowledge, or maybe they're, in another culture they might be slick with intubations, getting people onto ventilators quickly. Maybe they're a surgeon who takes on the most severe, the most too far gone patients. But in many cultures, it's whoever has published the most papers, who's perceived as the smartest person in the room. And often it's the person who's the fastest to reply to a question. And as I've learned, the wise leader in medicine, just as the wise leader, pilot or commander of a submarine or a nuclear power plant, doesn't bark the answers. They ask the questions. They're good at asking the questions. They're good at taking a step back and looking at the room and developing situational awareness for what's happening. A lot of us, though, have not learned that lesson, so we weaponize praise by praising people that we perceive as the most praiseworthy, when everybody in this room has a superpower. And wherever you work, whether you're doing something complicated that's personal in your life, or part of a job, or part of a job you used to do, or volunteer activities, running the Denman Island Readers and Writers Festival, you recognize, as a leader, you recognize this everybody's superpower, and you position and you learn about the people who are on your team, so that they can, so that they feel as if they're heard, understood. You create a climate, a culture of safety, where they feel that if a plan has been thought of a little too hasty, maybe there's some issues with it, that they feel comfortable telling you, and you feel comfortable hearing it. You run meetings where you don't slam the door on ideas. Do you know why people do that? Do you know why leaders often slam the door on ideas that they think are a little too way out there? And they say things like, we tried that last year and it didn't work. You must have missed the meeting when we discussed it. Why don't you get a few more years of experience under your belt before you come up with such bold ideas like that? The common denominator to all of those Like, all of those are symptoms of the problem. The problem is that they don't tolerate uncertainty.
Yes.
So there's uncertainty, there's a lot of uncertainty in medicine. You know, people don't come in with a neon sign saying aortic dissection about to blow in 2 hours and 5 minutes if you don't make the diagnosis and get the blood pressure down. We would do so much better and think better and make better diagnoses if we tolerated uncertainty for a few minutes. And so I teach some techniques for doing that. Certainly the big 3 questions that they teach, that docents teach at art museums to novices who've never looked at works of art before, are 3 questions that I learned about from Alexa Miller. The first one is, what do you see? Getting novices looking at a work of art. What do you see that makes you say that? So it might be a sculpture of 2 people in relation to one another, and somebody says, I think they're embracing one another. What do you see that makes you say that? Their hand positions. And maybe there's a discussion about the position or the perspective. Is it from above? Is it from the side? Is it from below? Another person, and then the third question is asked, what more can we find? So that's to keep us from getting too fixated on the first answer, which usually comes from the most aggressive person, the person who in medicine is the smart person who always answers every question right off the bat, and everybody falls in line after them. Oh, that must be correct. When you ask that third question, what more can we find, it encourages somebody who may be a little bit more timid or anxious to say, I think they're wrestling with one another. I don't think they're embracing one another. Oh, and the leader says, what do you see that makes you say that? And the group becomes a team as they change their minds, as the uncertainty gets they lean into the uncertainty, and then the uncertainty gets a little less uncertain, and maybe they go back originally to the first interpretation, and then they decide. This is actually a way of holding meetings that we could learn a lot from Indigenous people. They know how to run meetings. That's their culture, to discuss things until there is a general agreement, and it comes from a general understanding that's enriched by everybody's perceptions, not just the most aggressive or the fastest people. And we talk about cognitive, the mistakes that people make in medicine, and we make them in all serious industries, nuclear, regulatory, oil tankers that run aground, ferries that run aground, which we've heard. When we come to a fast conclusion, instead of allowing a little bit of uncertainty that allows our slower, more accurate mental processes to engage.
I relate completely to what you're saying with respect to meetings with Indigenous people. And I did some work in that field, and it took me the longest time to realize after somebody had spoken, it wasn't necessary for somebody else to speak right away. And oftentimes you'd sit and think about what was said and ponder it, etc., etc. Whereas the model you're describing is somebody's got to jump in instantly and say what they've got to say, and then you get this kind of dysfunctional chatter.
And you get, there are leaders who think that a good leader, a strong leader, eliminates uncertainty by replacing it with certainty, however false.
Mm-hmm. Now you don't. That technique is taught at certain medical schools back east, is it not?
It is. It's taught at Harvard Medical School. It's taught, I found that it was taught at University Hospital in Cork. It's taught around the world. I think it's a gem that hasn't gotten the airing that I think it deserves, because you can take that approach in front of a work of art and take it right to the bedside, where you've got a team of, a nurse practitioner, a physician assistant, students, nurses, social workers, allied health professionals, and what they're doing is they're figuring out what's wrong with the patient. You can also use it in a crisis in the resuscitation room or in the operating room where a patient may be having, a sudden airway or blood pressure crisis, and that's how you can work the problem. We're terrified that seconds will go by and the patient will die in the meantime, and we all suffer in healthcare from this weird time distortion where we think many minutes have gone by and they haven't when we use that kind of team approach. It's calmer, and one of the things you notice, if you eavesdrop in that room, they're not barking and screaming at one another, they're calm. And when you're calm, you think better. You come up with better solutions.
We had an interesting discussion at dinner the other night about the role of gender, which you don't talk directly about in the book, but the question of whether, when we think about the gunslingers, I think we think about guys. Talk about the role of, the increasing role, I think and hope, of a kind of feminine mystique, if you will, in the medical practice.
Certainly there is no question that we have many more women who are frontline healthcare workers beginning to become department heads and rising to higher levels, becoming heads of departments, deans, CEOs of hospitals. There are a lot of nurses that have become, and I don't think that's an accident. A lot of CEOs of hospitals were nurses, registered nurses in their earlier in their careers, and I think one of the reasons why they're more qualified than perhaps physicians is that they are acculturated to functioning in a team, and they understand the teamwork model. They understand. I think they also have empathy for people who are lower down in the pecking order of the hospital hierarchy. It is all that said. As we've heard in the media recently, there continue to be awful stories of young physicians who are sexually harassed, and we're also hearing, sadly, stories of fairly senior physicians who've been blocked in their journey to aspire to a higher level of leadership, to leadership positions, and it unfortunately, sexual discrimination continues to exist in healthcare, and it's one of the things that we ought to be properly ashamed of. That's something that we ought to be ashamed of, and it's something that it makes my blood boil. We've had stories on the air. I think next week we're going to have the story. We're going to repeat the show about Dr. Gabriel Horn, who was a cardiologist, a research cardiologist at Dalhousie, and for the sin of not agreeing to have her department head as a co-author of all of her research papers when he had nothing to do with any of her research. She was basically complained about, and she was ganged up upon, and she was complained about to the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Nova Scotia, and the issue or the complaint, the nature of the complaint against her, when she was the one who should have been complaining, was that what she was doing in her practice was endangering the welfare of patients. When you do that, that's a nuclear kind of attack. And she was removed from practice for a while. She had to go to the courts to be allowed back into practice. By then, her reputation had been all but destroyed, and she ended up winning the equivalent of a wrongful dismissal suit. It was the largest award of its kind for personal injury of that kind, one of the largest personal injury awards of its kind in Canada up to that point in time. It was knocked down somewhat on appeal, and the people who did that to her were allowed to just continue on in practice. And there have been other stories that Robin Doolittle has written about in the Globe and Mail in the last couple of years, talking about the glass ceiling in healthcare and breaking the glass ceiling in healthcare. So we have, to me, I think that there's good neuroscientific evidence to show that women bring more empathy into healthcare, kindness, and more of a predilection to work in teams, to see themselves as functioning in teams and seeing the inherent value of teamwork over individual accomplishment, individual endeavor. Both are necessary, but you have to have a balance between the two, and they seem to understand that balance much better. So my hope is that they will change the culture of medicine, but anybody who works in healthcare, and I've been at it for 40 years, knows that the culture is very strong. It's like an immune system. It sends out antibodies to fight against change, and to I think the detriment of not just patients, the patients we serve and their families, but the people who work in the system. They often get beaten down, and they don't have to be.
Mm-hmm. Well, the good news is we're almost through the first book. And we've got 17 minutes left. I do want to switch just a little bit here and talk about, you've got, in the first book, two of the sections I like, not like best, but really spoke to me, you're talking about dementia.
Yeah.
And there's a couple of lovely sections in there, particularly the one on the soul whispers, which I'd like you to talk about a little bit.
Yeah.
But talk first about the robotics that you encountered in Japan, because it's kind of a fun story and an enlightening story. And I particularly like the description of the elderly patient who would not respond to human beings, and yet when she was given a robotic doll or baby, she lit up and could chat away, etc., etc. You tell that story.
Yeah, so this was a little doll that is basic. It's a robotic doll that was teleoperated. That means that a healthcare provider, a social worker nearby would be speaking. And it distorted the voice and made the voice sound a little bit like a toddler's voice. It was the size of a preschooler with arms that could hug you, and a bottom, and kind of half thighs, almost flipper-like thighs, and so it could talk in a toddler's voice, and it would hug you. And I went to a long-term care facility in a place called Sendai, which was a site where if you know what the Fukushima nuclear power plant, that's where the tsunami washed over the power plant and endangered the protection of the radioactive rods from, there was an imminent danger that the spent material might be washed out, and they closed down the nuclear plant, and I was there for the 5th anniversary. But the other part of the story is that many people lost their lives in Sendai, including people who were partially evacuated from the long-term care facility that I visited. They moved to another place inland, so they're much farther away from another potential tsunami. So I was at this newly refurbished, at this brand new long-term care facility, and they had patients there with advanced dementia who would sunset. They would be up all night, and they would be, like as in a lot of other long-term care facilities, they were plopped in front of a television set, and they would kind of sit sleepily in front of the TV set all day until this little robot was put in their hands. And I saw with my own 2 eyes what would happen when, so these are people who were otherwise often vacant, not talking, agitated, not calm, and when the robots were placed in their arms, something magical would happen to them. They would come to life. They would start talking. The robot, teleoperated by a social worker or another healthcare provider, would sing songs. They would sing along. What they found there at the Keiko Sasaki, the head of the long-term care facility, told me that these people would say things to the robot that they would not say to the care providers. They confided in them. Some of them saw the little robot as child. Some knew that this was mechanically operated. But they were different, and they would hang on, they would hug the telerobot, and they would hang on to the mechanical device. You know, you almost had to pull it from their cold, dead hands. They just loved, and they treated it as a real entity, as a real human being. Quite different from, you know, a machine that could be wheeled around, that looked like a robot, that had a TV screen, and it would enable that person to communicate with their family off-site, remotely. They knew that was a device. It had a novelty factor, and when they got bored with it, they stopped using it. Not these devices that I've been talking about right now. And they saw them as real entities. And you know, the next step, that it's been studied, you know, it's very cost effective. The next step would be to develop autonomous robots that would be capable of listening to what they say and responding. That has some ethical considerations that I think need to be discussed. But that was a fantastic piece of technology, and not all that expensive.
I think what also needs to be discussed is your near fling with Erica the robot.
Yes. Yeah. I knew that if I were going to go to Japan, I wanted to talk to. I wanted to have a conversation with Erica. Erica an acronym, not important. What's important is that Erica is designed to respond and adapt to people who walk up to it. So you walk up to it, and I did, and Erica was sitting there in a bar-like setting. This was a robot that was developed by Dylan Glass, an American, under the auspices of a very famous roboticist from Japan named Ishiguro, who was famous for having a doppelganger who looked like him, a telerobot who he could send to conferences around the world. He would be sitting in an office speaking or in a lab in Kyoto speaking, and his telerobot would be turning and facing the members of the audience. And in fact, as he got a little older and he had more lines in his face, he underwent plastic surgery so that he would look as young as his robot. Anyway, I met Erica. Erica is a fantastic piece of engineering. Erica has heuristic algorithms that respond to my conversation with appropriate conversation. Unfortunately, she was supposed to grasp my name. She asked my name, and she kept getting my name wrong. She kept calling me John instead of Ryan.
And how did you feel about that?
I felt okay about that until an Aussie did the same demonstration and she got his name right. Then I felt jealous. I felt that Erica liked him a lot better than me. And that is the point. That's probably the most important thing that I learned. You know, people ask, you know, the question, you know, would it be like, are we going to adapt to having Android companions. So that was you started by talking about people with dementia. This effort to develop robots, companion robots, is part of a multi-billion-dollar moonshot in Japan, because they have the oldest population on Earth. There's something like 2.5 to 3 million personal support workers short. They have a culture that is relatively xenophobic. They will allow guest workers for 3 years and then off you go without a path to citizenship. That has to change, otherwise they're going to be relying on companion robots. And the question that's often asked, why would we, what proof is there that we would adapt as we get older, as we have dementia, to having robot companions? And we have a thirst for companionship. We have a desire for companionship, and what that means is that we will bond to any kind of creature, pets, plants, inanimate objects, if they show a couple of characteristics. If they appear to respond to us, and if they have the ability to kind of go away and come back, like a cat, and that kind of unpredictability, and that's been shown in studies. And in fact, the iRobot, the Roomba, is a perfect example. Like, you will bond to, if you have nobody else to bond with, you will bond to your Roomba as it makes its round. Oh, Roomba likes me. Oh, it's going away. Roomba doesn't like me anymore. Why doesn't Roomba like me? And so that was my kind of curious relationship to Erica. And I wanted to bond to her. I wanted her to respond to me uniquely in all of my idiosyncrasies. And in fact, her inability to master my name while mastering somebody else's name made me want her even more.
We've only got a couple of minutes left, unhappily. I wonder if...
Sorry, Tamara.
I wonder if we could finish up with the Soul Whispers, because that's a beautiful story and beautifully written up by you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the Soul Whisperer, Naomi Feil, a survivor of Nazi Germany, escaped with her dad, who was a psychologist. Her mom became the first social worker in America assigned to a long-term care facility at the Montefiore Jewish Home for the Aged in Cleveland. And Naomi grew up in the long-term care facility where her companions were people with dementia, people who were frail, had mobility issues and needed long-term care. They were her best friends, and they helped assuage a tremendous sense of isolation and loneliness that she felt as she was growing up as a young teenager in America, speaking English with an accent, with a German accent, being Jewish in an anti-Semitic society, growing up at a time when there was a fear of foreigners. We know that Japanese Americans were rounded up and placed in camps, and that's the climate. And she developed great empathy for people who were lonely, for people who were isolated, and people who had dementia. And she developed a method called validation. It's a way of communicating with people who are in the advanced stage of dementia that enables them to ask questions and help draw people out, and who are in the advanced stages of dementia, who are carrying out repetitive gestures like banging on on the side of a wheelchair or on a chair, and she had an astonishing ability, and she's still at it. She can teach. She teaches people. The method called validation has been taught to millions of healthcare providers who work with people who have dementia. This is a subject of great personal interest to me for a number of reasons. My late mother had dementia. My sister now has a form of dementia called frontotemporal dementia, and she's developed something called fluent aphasia, which means that she speaks, the words are English, but I can't understand what she's saying, and I'm trying to be the Joanne whisperer. It's hard because she has on her face a look of intense concentration. She's not vacant, she's present, and she can still understand. We can still have rudimentary conversations. The best I can do right now is to kind of enter a state of flow with her, where I'm kind of repeating the last word that she says, and I'll say pleasantries like, "That sounds like a good choice," and just to keep the flow going. And as long as she looks like she's calm and she's not agitated, then I think we're on the right track. And sometimes I can guess what she's talking about. But a lot of people believe that when somebody is in the moderate to severe stages of Alzheimer's dementia, and they are repeating the same phrase over and over again, that they are vacant. And what Naomi teaches us is that they are not vacant, they are present. They may be reliving a time in their lives of tumult, a time in their lives of emotional turmoil, maybe a time when they were abused by a parent, when physically, they were the subject of physical or the object of physical cruelty, or a moment of humiliation, or quite the opposite, a moment when they had purpose and agency, when they were in their element, in their prime, and they're reliving that. And if you can validate that instead of denying it, instead of saying, if they say that my grandmother's coming over, she's right there, instead of saying things like, "Oh no, I know from the death certificate that your grandmother died 40 years ago." If you say something like, "And what would you say to her?" It's not a lie. "And what would you say to her?" You're validating how they feel. If you validate how they feel, those agitated behaviors lessen. They feel validated, they're calm, they're participating in activities, they are not agitated, they are more likely to sleep at night and be active and during the daytime. And I think it's intuitively it makes so much sense, and personally it makes a lot of sense for me.
And the endeavor is to get in as much as possible inside that consciousness, correct? As opposed to dragging that consciousness into yours.
Precisely. You're entering their world, you're empathizing with them, and I have never met anybody as adept at empathizing with people with dementia as Naomi Fox.
Yeah. We're getting the hook.
We're getting the hook?
So,
yes.
I want to thank you. You're fun to be with up here.
Thank you. Thank you. And now we get to hear about an incredible bike ride through Uzbekistan.